talk about is some what I call non-canonical cases of complementation. That is to say, cases that are not normally studied under the rubric of complementation or studied at all. And the idea of studying these is that I think that they reveal properties of the canonical complementation system that we don't see when we just study canonical complements. And also they reveal what I think are fundamentally important properties of the embedding predicates that participate in clausal complementation, in particular a subgroup of those, which I call the say predicates, say in small caps. So the goal is to show that we can develop a principled account of predicate complement compatibility for these predicates and complements using the notion of force, basically more or less as it's used in literature on illocutionary clause or speech acts. And I'm going to try to illustrate this just with respect to WH clauses. So I'm trying to carve out a piece of this that I hope is, it's a little tricky to do this, and it may not work completely, but that's my attempt. So what I'm going to look at then is cases like those in 1, which are canonical cases of complementation. And these are the 3 kinds of verbs that are normally talked about in the literature on complement selection, which in fact Alexander mentioned in his talk. So the 3 commonly identified patterns of complementation for WH clauses are 1, verbs like assert, which don't occur with WH clauses at all. 2, verbs like ask, which occur with WH clauses and not with that clauses. And 3, verbs like announce, which occur with both that clauses and WH clauses. Okay. The fundamental claim that I'm going to be building on is, well, there's several pieces to it. First of all, these are instances of what I call say scheme of predicates. What I mean by that, and I'll illustrate it in a bit more detail later, but what I mean by that is they're predicates for which the complement determining component is the universal abstract predicate say, not the English morpheme say, although the English morpheme say is related to that abstract predicate. And the proposal that I am advancing is that only say scheme of verbs, that is verbs whose complement determining property is say, can report speech acts, okay, certain kinds of speech events, can at the same time as reporting their content and their force. So if you think of these as indirect discourse verbs, then what they're reporting is the force of the direct discourse that they are indirectly reporting. That they are indirect reports of. They are reports of. Now, the second critical piece here, in addition to the role of the verb say, the abstract predicate say, is the following hypothesis, that just as a main clause must have force, so a reported main clause must have force. That is, a reported speech act must encode the force of the speech act that it reports. Okay. And that's going to be one of the core principles. So what it comes down to is the universal abstract predicate say is the only predicate that can report force, and in fact it must report force. Its complements must encode the force of the speech act that they are reporting. Okay? Now, I should make it extremely clear that this makes a very fundamental distinction between say predicates and, for example, epistemics. The claim is absolutely not that believe reports force. This is not force in the sense of Reese 1997. This is force in the sense of assertion, question, imperative, command, exclamation. Okay, now one property of these verbs that I want to bring to your attention is that one can in fact discover properties of what these verbs report by looking at discourses, which do not involve any causal complementation at all. Okay? And when we do that, we already begin to get a sense of how these non-canonical complementation cases are going to differ from the canonical complementation cases in 1. If you look at 1, what you see is that ask has a property in common with announce. They both take WH complements. And what you also see is that announce has a property in common with assert. They both take that complements. Okay? So when you just look at the canonical complementation structures, it's not totally clear what is really patterning with what. Okay? And I'll mention it a little later. Some of the work that has probed that, which I'm building on here, including work by Ginsberg and Saag and Lahiri. Okay, so let me show you the kind of discourse I have in mind. So if you consider a situation like this, X says, my flight leaves at 6. And Y asks, what just happened? How can a third person reply? Well, the third person can say, X asserted something, or the person can say, X announced something, but they cannot say, X asked something. And this has nothing to do with causal complementation per se, because there's no causal complement, it's just something. Okay? On the other hand, if X says, when does my flight leave? And Y says, what just happened? Then the third person cannot say X asserted something, and cannot say X announced something, but they can say X asked something. Now what this shows us is that, in fact, announce is different from say in a crucial respect. Announce here is not patterning with say, it's actually patterning with assert. Okay? And what that suggests to us is that the right division among these predicates and among the complement cases in 1 would treat announce as, in some sense, related to assert rather than, in some sense, related to ask. In particular, it looks like, and I will argue that this is true, announce does not report question events. Okay? Announce reports events of assertion, as does assert. Now, they aren't quite the same, but that's not the difference between them. Okay, this is the idea that I'm going to be working on. Okay, so on the top of page 2, so the force-related properties of say stream of verbs can be detected independently of their complementation. At least that's an idea which I think is important for learning. If you want to understand how children learn what these predicates mean, it's more likely that they hear discourses like this than that they plow through the vagaries of the English complementation system to figure it all out. Okay. So, as I said at the top of page 2, ask reports only speech events which are questions. It's what I will call a Q force verb. It's just a label. And announce report, like assert, reports only speech events which are assertions. The announce examples both report the same assertion, but they do it in different ways. So, if the original assertion is my flight leaves at 6, if I want to commit to the time that the person said, then I use the that clause. X announced that the flight leaves at 6. But if I want to commit to the truth because of the veridicality kind of effects that Alexandra was talking about, if I want to commit to the general truth of what was said but not the specific time that the person chose, then I can report it using the WH clause, X announced when the flight leaves. So those are two different ways of reporting an assertion, but they commit to different aspects of the assertion. That's a rough idea. Okay. We can skip the bit and square brackets. So the puzzle here is that the morphosyntactic of the clausal complements in 1 doesn't correspond to what we've just seen about what they report. Okay? So there's two verbs that both think WH complements, but one reports questions and the other one reports assertions. And the resolution of this that I want to suggest is that the well-formedness of these combinations is not determined by the morphosyntax. It's not plus minus WH that matters. What matters is their compatibility with the force of the event that they're reporting. And that force itself does not correspond directly in a one-to-one fashion with morphosyntactic structure. So for English, it is the case that the inventory of morphosyntactic clause structures is highly impoverished compared to the number of distinctions that are involved in getting predicate complement compatibility right. So if we think about finite clauses, in English there's two kinds of finite clauses, clausal complements in essence, that clauses and WH clauses. But there is, maybe 30 different types of them, but I don't know how to classify them obviously. There's many semantic distinctions, including that of factivity, for example, which we're very familiar with, which isn't reflected at all in the morphosyntax, so that complement is the same, whether it's factive or not factive. And in fact, I think the fact that we have not been able to predict which predicates take which clausal complements is, at least in part, due to the assumption that it's the morphosyntax that is the key sort of juncture between the two, and I don't think that's actually true. And if you ever try to describe these things using plus minus WH, you'll quickly come to the conclusion that it's actually not possible to give any kind of interesting characterization of the system at all. Okay. So that's the idea. So, so the well-formedness of a safe scheme of a verb like announce, assert, ask, in combination with the clause will depend on the force encoded by the clause, which is constrained by the morphosyntax. That clauses are never questions. WH clauses are candidates for questions, status. It's constrained by the morphosyntax, but it also depends on the force that the verb encodes and its meaning. For ask, that's question force. For assert, that's the assert force. And for announce, it's also the assert force. This characterization of announce as an assertion verb that takes WH complements is actually, I think, compatible with and certainly dependent upon the results of research by Ginsberg and Saad and Lahiri on what they variably called resolutive, or what does Lahiri call them? Something else. I can never remember. Responsive. Okay, so how does it work? Roughly, in a quick version. Well, the forces that I'm going to talk about here are assertion and question. The system extends in principle to exclamatives and imperatives, and I have looked at that. Let's look at the clauses. The key idea is that a main WH clause always has force, because every main clause has force. A main WH clause is a question, provided that it meets certain syntactic conditions. It has to have a WH in the spec position and has subject-auxiliary inversion in English. If it doesn't have subject-auxiliary inversion in English, it's an exclamation. And that's the simple. Quoted WH clauses are main clauses, always. Therefore, they have force, and they have the force of the clause that they quote. Therefore, they have Q force, they're questions. A subordinated WH clause, in contrast, has no force intrinsically. It's not intrinsically a question. It's not intrinsically not a question. It's just actually a morphosyntactic structure onto which a force can be added. And notice that WH structures appear all over English in a wide variety of different kinds of configurations. Relative clauses, exclamatives, free relatives, these assertion cases that I'm talking about here, and so forth. So it's by no means true, anyway, that WH structure is special to questions. It's a more general strategy for creating a variable bound by some sort of operator, which can then be exploited in various ways. So just a note, so note number one, I use the if I want to write down the force of a complement to say that does not intrinsically have force, like a WH force, I write down X force. X is a variable over forces. Secondly, I am well aware that quoted clauses are not the same as non-quoted clauses. And we will, this will be important, but the essential assumption that I'm going to make is that the difference between quoted clauses and non-quoted clauses lies in the fact that one's a quote and one's not. And that what it means to be a quote is that there is an instance of a speech act to which there is a faithfulness requirement. So the prosody, the lexicalization, the force, and everything else must be faithful to the material being quoted. And that is, of course, irrelevant for subordinate. For a non-quoted clause, there's no such target to be faithful to. Okay, now the verbs. All say schema predicates are verbs. There are no say schema adjectives. An example of the complement of a say schema verb must have a force specification. Force specified verbs, Q force or A force, A stands for assertive force, combines with a clause if and only if their clause specifications are compatible. They cannot disagree. Okay? One can be specified, the other not, but they cannot disagree. And then on page 3, the verb and the clause are incompatible, as I just said, if their force specifications disagree. If and only if. So, schematically in 4, if the verb is a Q force verb like ask, and the clause is a Q force clause, that's fine. If the verb is a Q force verb and the clause is an X force clause, that's fine. X is a variable. There's no incompatibility between the specifications. They're not the same, but they're not incompatible. What is bad is to have, as in 5, a Q force verb, a verb that reports question events with an A force complement, for example, a that complement, if that's what the right answer is for that complement, which is another story. And similarly, as in 6, an A force verb can combine with an A force clause. An A force verb cannot combine with a Q force clause, but an A force verb can combine with a clause that has no force. What is bad, and this is important for getting the empirical generalizations to follow, what is bad is the second schema in 8. If the verb does not encode, say, if the say verb does not encode force, and the clause does not encode force, that's ill-formed, because that's a case of a say schema verb reporting a speech event with no force assigned to the speech event. That's like having a main clause with no force. Ill-formed for basically the same reason. Okay. There is a little evidence, which I'll mention later, that force is actually encoded in a projection above the CP, at least in some languages. In English, there's no direct evidence for this, unless it comes from when we unpack the internal semantics of say predicates, which I'm not going to talk about today. Okay, there's a couple of auxiliary hypotheses. Okay. Again, I mentioned this already, quoted clauses. The hypothesis I want to make is that quoted clauses are not subordinate, but they are complements. Or in some configurations, they are complements. Okay, this is actually a little bit related to some of the distinctions that Uli was working on this morning. So, for example, a quoted clause that occurs in post-verbal position satisfies the requirement of a predicate that have an obligatory argument, just as well as a subordinate clause does. For example, actually, characteristically, say verbs take obligatory complements outside of null complement analysis. And there's some generalizations here that might be worth pursuing, but anyway. So verbs like announce, report, assert, claim, they all require complements. You can't say he asserted, he claimed. You have to have a complement. But you can have either a non-quoted complement or a quoted complement. So you can say, he asserted, this is the worst city in the universe. Or you can have, he asserted that Paris is the worst city in the meaningless. They're both ways of satisfying that requirement. So the view that's sometimes taken, I mean, this is basically heresy, what I'm saying here. The view that is generally taken is that quoted material is not integrated into the clauses that it is near. The one paper I'm aware of that actually literally argues that clauses can be complements is by Bonamy and Godard. It's in the references. It's about French, and it makes a case with some of the same arguments that I make for English. Okay, so that's point number one. So there are many differences between subordinated, grammatically subordinated clauses, which have sequence of tense, they may have complementizers, etc., and quoted clauses. But the difference is not that quoted clauses are not integrated into the clause theory. That's wrong. I don't think that's right. The other thing to watch out for is there's massive morpheme ambiguity in English. So many morphemes participate in both the say system and in other systems as well. One example is the verb observe. So you can say, he observed that it was raining, and it can mean either he looked out of the window and saw that it was raining, or it can mean he said it was raining. And the same is true for note, but notice is only a perception verb. So when you're doing the analysis of these things, you have to pay attention not just to the morpheme, but to the instance of the morpheme that you're looking at. I discovered this because I couldn't get consistent analyses of predicates I was trying to analyze, because they would come up as say predicates and by one criterion, and then would come up as not say predicates by another criterion. And finally I woke up and realized they were ambiguous. So now we come to the central paradigm and where non-canonical complementation becomes all important. Okay. So I'm going to look at 4 WH clausal structures. One is the canonical complementation structure, where you have a subordinated WH clause after the verb. The other 2 are what I call non-canonical, for reasons that you'll see. So one is a quoted clause in complement position. The other 2 non-canonical structures both involve main clauses posting parentheticals, where the embedded predicate is inside the parenthetical. Okay. Now, the trees, well, let me give you the data first and show you how it works for ask in 9. Okay. And this is the kind of central paradigm. So with a verb like ask, you can actually combine it with a WH clause in 4 different ways, and they're all good. So the president asked whose plan has succeeded. That's a subordinated WH clause. The president asked whose plan succeeded. That's a quoted WH clause. Note it has to have the prosody of the original. So it's a separate intonation phrase. Okay. Third, you can have a quoted WH clause as the main clause of the sentence supporting a parenthetical which contains the verb ask with no overt complement. Okay? So, whose plan has succeeded? The president asked. So there, the embedding predicate is ask, which is bolded, but it's inside a parenthetical indicated by parentheses. And it's the interpretation is, in terms of predicates and arguments, the interpretation is the president asked whose plan has succeeded. Okay? And then D is a case of slifting, so dubbed by Ross in his paper on slifting in 1970 something. I think it's in there. Slifting is, if you're familiar with free indirect discourse, free indirect discourse is slifting without the parenthetical. Okay. So the slifting case is indeed, whose plan has succeeded, the police asked. Well, that's not a direct quote. The police asked whose plan has succeeded, but the reported clause looks like the complement in 9a with respect to sequence of tense. So these are the 4 different cases of complementation. Now, let me just Okay, no, let me not say, hang on one second. Let me do, okay. The examples in 10 and 11 just show that if you construct the counterparts of these four clauses for that clauses or assertions, ask does not occur in any of them, which you kind of already knew. So you can't say, the president asked, my plan has succeeded. And that's not possible. So, at some level, the most basic point here is that when you combine a quote and a say verb, or a main clause, as in 9D, and a say verb, you still get effects of the kind that we normally think of as complement selection effects. There are compatibility effects between the verb ask, even though it's not in the canonical relationship to the WH clause. There are still compatibility effects. Okay. Let's look at structures. The first one is easy to understand, even if it is heretical. The second one is more difficult to understand. So the structure in 12, this is a structure for 9a and b, the case where you have a subordinated WH complement or a quoted WH complement. And in the structure in 12, I have put quotation marks around every node in the quoted clause. Okay? So it's simply the structure the president asked, and then it's a normal CP with a WH phrase and specifier of CP. If you remove the quotation marks, you get the structure for the non-quoted complement. So the structure is the same whether it's a direct quote that's acting as the complement, or is the complement of the verb, or whether it's a subordinate clause that's the complement of the verb. So those are completely, those are familiar, except for the fact that the quote here is being treated as a complement. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. 13 is the trickier one to kind of get an intuitive feel for. The piece on the left-hand side is the same CP that we just looked at. It's the CP whose plan has failed, directly quoted. Or if you take the quotation marks off, it would become whose plan had failed. Okay. And it is hosting a parenthetical. The parenthetical that it's hosted is the FP on the right, where FP just stands for functional projection. And that parenthetical contains the president asked, nothing. Okay? Now, in the literature on these things, the analysis that seems to have the most traction is one in which there is an operator in the specified position of the functional projection, as I put it here, and a trace in the complement position of ask. So there's a chain inside the parenthetical. And in case you're curious, the evidence for that comes from island effects, among other effects. But that's not so terribly important to us. What is important is, again, in terms of predicate-argument relations, that embedding verb ask, the question force verb, which is embedded inside the adjunct here, the parenthetical, is combining with, indirectly, the CP. Okay? Now, I call this non-immediate complementation, or, is that what we're calling it? Mediated complementation. Because, obviously, the CP is not actually in the position of the complement of the verb, rather, a trace or something is in the complement position of the verb, and that trace is associated with the operator at the top of the functional projection, and that is associated with the host of the parenthetical. Okay? So the relationship of complementation is mediated here. It's not direct. Another way to think about this is actually very similar to, it's similar to something like the president asked this, whose plan failed. Okay, where the complement of ask is this, but the content of that is provided by the clause, whose plan failed. This is the same actual structure as this, but doesn't involve all the fancy movement structures and things like that. Is that making enough sense? The only thing that really matters at the end of the day Ask is combining with the clause. Okay? Okay, so what happens with the verb ask and a WH clause in these four structures? They're all good. Okay? Why am I telling you this? Because when we turn to announce, what we find is only one of them is good. So if you look at 14, we've already seen that the verb announce, being a resolutive or responsive predicate, that is a name rather than an explanation, combines with subordinated WH complements as in 14. But it cannot go in any of the three non-canonical structures that I just talked about. So you cannot say, whose initiative had succeeded, the president announced. You cannot say the president announced, whose initiative has succeeded. And you cannot say, whose initiative has succeeded, the president announced. These are all completely terrible. Okay? Now, why are they terrible? Well, it's not because announce doesn't combine with quotes and all this fancy stuff, because it does, and I'm sure that in 16 and 17 with assertions. Okay, I won't go through that. Those are controls. They're there for control purposes. So it's not because announce doesn't combine with quotes at all or anything like that. It's because announce doesn't combine with questions. Announce does not report questions, it reports assertions. Moreover, in 15, every one of these WH clauses is a main clause. Every one of these WH clauses is a main clause, carries question force. Therefore, it cannot be combined with announce, which is not a question force taking saver. So, the difference between question and announce, ask and announce is ask combines with all four types of WH clauses. Subordinated complement, quoted main clause, regular, non-quoted main clause. And announce occurs only with the subordinated WH complement. So, looking at these non-canonical complements reveals the split between the announce type WH complement taker and the ask type WH complement taker. It's been argued for on other grounds. Shows that distinction just splitting right down the middle. Okay? If you look only at WH complements, you have to be extremely clever to find evidence that they're different. If you look at these kind of complements, you don't have to be clever to find evidence that they're different. Okay, so there's a summary in 18. The columns that matter for us are just the ask column and the announce column. And what you can see, you don't have to really read the labels on the row. Ask allows all of these different question structures, and announce allows only the WH clause, the WH clause, which is a subordinated complement, the canonical case of WH complementation. Okay? So that's just a summary of the generalizations that we've seen. You get a Y under announce for the immediate complement WH and no for everything else. It just never combines with the things that have to be questions. And we can actually replicate this using pseudoclefts. Actually, that's not true. That was a lie. What I just said was false. Get that. Okay. Now, so what's the idea? Why do subordinated WH clauses, the ones with sequence of tense and all those other good things that come with subordination, why do they behave differently? Well, the hypothesis is that WH complements do not themselves encode force. Main clause WHs encode force, WH complements do not themselves encode force. Therefore, they can combine only with a verb that can give them a force. Because, as we said at the very beginning, indirect discourse is subject to the same time as direct discourse. Main clauses must have force, reported main clauses must also have force. So, since WH complements do not encode force, they can only combine with predicates that themselves impose force, and indeed a force that's compatible with the WH clause. Okay. And the hypothesis is that ask is such a predicate. Of course, there are others. And that announce is not such a predicate. Okay. In order to speed up, let me just go to 21, which is a representation of the argument structure of ask and announce as instantiations of what I call the say schema. So ask is a verb that takes an agent. The first column in 23 takes it combines with agents and potentially with goals. Crucially, it combines with questions. Okay. In contrast, announce is a predicate that also, it's a say predicate, which also combines with agents and goals, but it combines with assertions. Okay. So the hypothesis is that it's part of the meaning of ask that it combines with questions, part of the meaning of announce that it combines with assertions, and there's no selection involved in the sense of no statements beyond these statements of the, essentially say is a function from assertions to functions from individuals, etc. Okay. Now, what we can further hypothesize, and this is indicated here in the possible structural representation, is that what ask actually is a realization of the abstract predicate say plus a complement with Q force. So one could actually hypothesize that ask is a lexicalization of this subpiece of structure. Now there's various ways to think about that depending on theoretical perspectives, biases, etc. But this is a way to think about this. And in fact, there's an ongoing paper by a graduate student at Rutgers arguing that in Spanish, K realizes the force position in WH structures. So there is some evidence cross-linguistically that for this kind of structure. Okay, now we get some predictions out of this system in terms of what a force verb can be like, a say verb can be like. For example, no, let me skip the first one here and just go to the second one. No verb can take only WH complements. That is by which I mean no verb can take only subordinated WH complements and not also take the non-canonical complements that I've been talking about. Okay? How does this follow? Well, if a verb takes a WH complement, the verb must have a force specification, because a WH complement doesn't have a force specification. But if the verb has a force specification, then it's either got question force or assertion force. If it has question force, it must combine with quotes in both configurations and with main clause questions inside parentheticals. If it's got the assertion specification, it has to combine with the assertion counterparts of those. So the general point here is that if we set up a system like this, as opposed to describing each verb that we encounter, we actually make predictions about what is a possible type of verb in the system and what is not a possible type of verb in the system. Okay, let me go on to the last sort of empirical point I want to make, which is the following at the top of page 9. So, I've said that the verb asking codes Q force, the verb announcing codes assertion force. Therefore, each of them can combine with only one set of complements. Okay? But the WH subordinate clause occurs in both sets, because it itself doesn't have a force specification, but it doesn't care. Right? But there is one circumstance under which we would expect a verb to be able to combine with both the assertion-bearing complements and the question-bearing complements. And that's the following case. If the verb itself has no force specification, but is a say verb and is therefore compatible with force specifications in its complements. So we're not talking about believe. That doesn't have a force specification, but it's just the wrong kind of verb. We're talking about verbs of the say, verbs that have say as their complement determining predicate. Okay, are there any such verbs? Yes. Okay, oddly enough, since I happen to mention it, there are. How do we find them? Well, evidence that a verb does not encode force. There's actually, I didn't order this properly, but first of all, we can look at the discourses that these verbs can be used to report, just like with something as their complement, just like I did with the embedding verbs at the beginning. Secondly, we can look at the clauses that it can combine with. And thirdly, it turns out we can actually find among these verbs the presence of meaning specifications that we don't find anywhere else in the embedding system. That is to say, a unique set of characteristics that we can identify with non-force-bearing say verbs. Okay, and I'll show you what I mean in 24. This is a list of some of the non-force-bearing say verbs that I have discovered. So, first one is say by means, usually called manner of speaking. They're not manner, they're not speaking. They're means of saying. Say with attitude, verbs like right, bitch. Say with expression, verbs like beam and scowl. Some interesting ones, the response stance verbs of Patel, verbs like reply, answer, respond. Verbs like go, which don't even encode modality. Now, focusing on the ones toward the top end, where there's high productivity, etc. What happens in these cases is, and I'll just tell you in words very quickly, there's an independent morpheme, which encodes, for example, means, like groan or shout, or encodes attitude, like bitch. Okay, there's a word bitch, you can say she bitched for hours. You combine that with the abstract predicate say, you get the complement-taking properties of say, so now you have a verb that can take a clausal complement, and as a result of that combination, you get complementation patterns like she groaned that she had yet more work to do, or she bitched that she had to work too hard, and so on and so forth. Okay, now these verbs, if you turn to page 10, and then look at 4.2, what we find is that these verbs can be used to report speech events regardless of the force of the original event. Okay? So, going back to our paradigm from 2 and 3, if X shouts, my flight leaves at 6, and somebody asks what happens, person number 3 can say, Sally shouted something. But person number 3 can say that equally well if the original utterance was a question. So if X shouts, when does my flight leave? And somebody asks what just happened, then Z can report by saying, Sally shouted something. It's a completely valid report of the speech event. Okay? Unlike in the case of ask and announce, where announce suddenly becomes bad when the original utterance was a question. Because a question can't be an event of announcement, but a question can be an event of shouting. Shouting doesn't care about the force. As a result, the shout, as a result, the shouting predicates combine with that complements, which I'm not focusing here at all, but combine with quoted questions in both configurations, combine with main clause questions. The one thing they don't combine with is subordinated WH complements. So it's very odd, depending, and there's some details here which I want to mention, it's odd to say, Sally shouted what time her flight left. Sally shouted how soon her flight left. It's particularly, absolutely, grotesquely impossible to use that sentence to describe the event in 28. So if Sally shouted, when does my flight leave? You absolutely cannot report that as Sally shouted what time her flight left, or when her flight left. That's absolutely, totally out. If it's possible at all to use the WH complement here, it has to be construed as an assertion. So it's sort of marginally possible, as Sally shouted that her time left at 6 o'clock. Marginally possible to report that as Sally shouted when her flight left. People differ slightly in tolerance for these. Everybody agrees about they don't have a question. Varying the verb here gives sharper effects, and there's a possible reason for this. So Sally bitched. So Sally's flight leaves at 6 a.m. You cannot say Sally bitched when her flight left. It's just. Likewise, you can't say Sally answered when her flight left. You would think you should be able to, but you actually don't. Now, but you can say Sally shouted, "What time did my flight leave?" Sally shouted, "Stop that." Sally shouted, "Let's go now." Sally shouted, "It's raining." It doesn't matter what the force is. What force is encoded in the clauses that combine with shall. And that's true for all of these verbs that don't encode force. Okay? They're compatible with any clause that is force-bearing. The thing they're not compatible with is WH, subordinated WH complements, because they are not questions. They do not themselves intrinsically have force.
But they do combine with embedded that clauses.
They do combine with embedded that clauses. And one possible explanation for that. Okay, when I first started working on this is what I said, and it may be sort of right. That encodes the force. And one of the things that we know about manner of so-called the means of saying verbs is the complementizer is obligatory. And actually, that's true. It's true with all of these force-less verbs that the complementizer is obligatory. So that's answer number one. I'm not.
Sorry, but what do you mean? So it's just syntactically required.
Well, that's not. I have. No. Sorry. Okay, it's ungrammatical to use these verbs without that complementizer, right? That's true for repeat and bitch and write. It's not just true. People know about manner of speaking verbs, but it's actually true of a much wider group. So one could hypothesize that the complementizer that encodes the force in that case. And it would then be required not for syntactic reasons but for semantic reasons. It will be required in order to give the complement of a say verb a force which it wouldn't otherwise have. Now, the reason why I'm not completely sure that that's the right explanation is because that complement are spread massively across embedding predicates, even more massively than WH complements.
But not with ask, so therefore you.
But not with ask, right. So if you say that, what you have to then say is one of the following, perhaps, that can encode assertion force, but doesn't have to, because it's not encoded assertion force when it combines with believe.
Well, promise.
That's
maybe
one.
Even other illocutionary verbs.
Sure.
That are not assertive.
No, absolutely. Right. So you cannot say that is exclusively assertive. So.
But it depends what you mean by assertive. I think that's part of the question. Do you mean something that has a truth value? Or
I mean reports a speech event that you would classify as an assertion.
Yeah. Okay. But.
So promise does not. Promise does not report assertions, right? I take it doesn't report assertions.
Sure.
I mean that's the. I mean the reason that I'm using that notion is because that's what the quotes intrinsic and the main clauses. That's how they work, right? I mean a quote is quoting a main clause. And if main clauses have assertions, and if they have forces, then the quote has the same. That by assumption, the quote simply retains that force. So I'm not trying to make up a different theory of force for these cases. I'm trying to use the same one. The other possibility, maybe I should. Did you want to ask something else?
No, it's just that maybe you. That would be a prediction. Maybe that in a language with an explicit overt Q morpheme, maybe you could do that. You could have
Absolutely. Well, K in Spanish works that way, according to this analysis. So K goes on top of WH, but it only goes on top of WH with say verbs. And it only goes on top of WH with question taking say verbs, not with announce type say verbs. So the prediction is not that you cannot, thank you, the prediction is not that you cannot have a clause type that uniquely says, I report questions. But if you do, you know what its distribution has to be, right? It should occur with the shout type verbs. It should occur with ask, it should not occur with announce. And that's what happens with K in Spanish. So that's exactly right. And some of these systems that have, complex complementizer systems seem to have, one that goes only with say predicates, and then sometimes one that, not all of them, I don't know. Yeah. I'm not saying it's impossible for the. So maybe we can come back to that in a second, because I'm just about at the end. Because it is the reason I chose to talk about WH. There's a reason why I chose to talk about WH. Okay. So where are we? Okay. Let's. I think we've pretty much touched on the nuances here. So just a quick point in section 5. It is, of course, true that subordinated WH clauses combine with a whole bunch of predicates that are not say predicates. Okay? The other three structures that I'm talking about here do not combine with verbs other than say verbs. So you might have thought that the crucial property of ask is that it's a WH complement only verb, and that makes it possible with all of these, with these other three clause structures. That is not true. So the other verbs, the verbs that have been discussed in Ginsburg and Saad and Lahiri and elsewhere that are WH only verbs include epistemic, or at least verbs related to knowledge, roughly speaking, such as investigate or research or examine, which also take only WH complements, like ask does. However, if you look at 37, what you see is that it's a bit misleading. Ignore 37b for a moment. Look at 37a, c, and d. What we find out is that investigate is incompatible with all three of the non-canonical complements that I've been talking about. It doesn't combine with WH quotes. It doesn't combine with WH main clauses that are not quoted in the Slipton construction, which is illustrated in 37b. So you cannot say whose initiative has succeeded the precedent investigated. This was noticed by Ross in his original paper on Slipton, though he didn't, of course, know. So these are good with say predicates, the say predicates that embed questions, but it's not good with non-say predicates, even those that only take WH complements like investigate. Okay. Why is the WH complement possible? Well, here's the claim here, right? The WH complement to a verb like investigate does not have the structure in 37b because that structure is ill-formed. Investigate cannot combine with force. It's not a say predicate. Only say ever combines with force in this system. So the WH complement to investigate is represented as in 38. It does not have the force phrase present. It just has the WH structure. And what I want to emphasize here is that there is an important piece of structure, namely the WH structure subpart of the clause, that is shared across epistemic predicates, depend type predicates, logical relation predicates, and say predicates. So I'm not saying that there's no relationship between the kind of complement you get with in a WH announce or an investigate type predicate. They're all utilizing the same morphosyntactic resources, namely the WH movement pattern. They're all using that structure. So what we see in 39 is a say verb that combines with question force has the representation, the first representation then. It takes a force phrase as its complement, and if it's ask, then that force phrase would have Q force as its force. Whereas an epistemic verb or adjective or one of logical relations or something like that, takes a simple CP as a complement with no force to that. Okay? Again, I'm not saying that every clause has force. I'm not using force to mean type. It means the force of the utterance in the original discourse when it was a main verb, a main clause in effect. Okay. There is one thing to note about this, which is that I think one way to think about this is to think of the WH structure as having the interpretation of an issue. That is something with an open value. When embedded under force, you get the question interpretation, the literal question, the ask a question interpretation, the discourse question interpretation. Elsewhere, you get the issue interpretation. Okay, and the distribution of WH issues and WH discourse questions is completely different. So issues combine with adjectives, combine with non-say verbs, combine with stated predicates. They also combine with prepositions. So if you think about things like, they talked about how many students were coming today. There's nothing about that has anything to do with questions. Okay? The discourse that's reported need not have contained a single question. It could have been me saying, I think there's 5 students coming today, and you say, no, there's 7, and somebody else says, no, I disagree, last week there were 15. That's we talked about how many students are coming. It's nothing to do with questions at all.
Queries, you mean there's nothing to do with
discourse questions. It has to do with issues. Right? I mean, you can ask questions about issues, right? So there's a natural connection between them. Moreover, in English, though, all the words are ambiguous. The word question itself is ambiguous. So you can, as researchers, we say things like, well, I'm asking, how many verbs there are. And I'm not asking. It's not a discourse question. I'm investigating.
The question is, yeah.
So the question, the real question is, how does say verbs work? The question. Right? So you can ask and you can question and you're talking about issues. So it's the language itself, I think, is heavily ambiguous. As in 42, so we can ask why the verb investigates its way. I can ask you all I want, but that's not what I mean by that. Okay, so I think I should stop there because we're certainly out of time, but hopefully we can come back to some of the questions. So, thank you.
About left dislocated sentences.
Okay, they're not actually left dislocated. Maybe
That's exactly what I think. And I wrote something on free and direct discourse, and I said that dislocated sentences were paratactic and not move because they
correct.
don't.
Right.
But Benfield, who spoke about free and direct discourse, that's one of your examples. She has examples. She says you can't say, like, he was tired, Homer sniffed, or Homer gurgled. And taking that to be true.
Yeah, there's disagreement about
I took those things, as she said, not every thing introducing indirect discourse can can correspond to a free indirect discourse, and so I took that to mean that that the regular paratactic dislocated things, it passed by a pronoun, and that the pronoun was this, as you mentioned, going this. He said this, and in the other ones, free indirect discourse, which have means, he said thus, and that's thus spake, thus spoke Zarathustra, and thus she thought, and so that's not quite that's not quite how the leftist look. I mean, the paratactic part of your
right. So
I mean, some of them it seems that you can say a lot of things. I mean, she quotes Joyce, okay? So this was wrong. He capped, right? He capped, and that doesn't really mean anything except but cap means something in a manner, sort of. She's introducing, I mean, Joyce was sort of introducing. He capped the whole conversation off by saying. So what do you think about that?
Well, so let me focus my answer on a couple of points. So first of all, the tree we should look at for this is the one in 13 on page 5, which has the clause preceding the subject and the embedding verb. So that's the case that you're asking about.
Yeah.
And so one question about these structures. This is what Ross called slifting when the clause is not quoted. So it was raining, she said. Okay, that would be a simple example of it. Okay, first of all, although Ross did analyze them as pre-post clauses, they don't behave as if they're pre-post. So, for example, you can't have a complementizer. So you can't have, but it was raining, she said.
No.
Okay.
You can if you say, if you can motivate a pronoun. That it was raining. She never said.
That's right. And
she never said
so
that.
There's a different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a different structure.
Yeah.
Which does involve, which is contrastive, as your intonation suggested. It's contrastive, and it does. And there you have to have the complementizer, and you have to have something like never. So, I have said many rude things in my life, but that John is an idiot, I have never said. You could do that. You can see the prosody is completely different. Some verbs allow it, some verbs don't. It doesn't respond to the same conditions as this. Secondly, the idea that these things are all are related to something like John said this, blah blah blah. So I've worked through that paradigm for these clause types. Here's what happens. You can do it. Okay. John said this. John asked this. Why are you doing that? John announced this. Why are you doing that? Bad. Right. Same effect pops right up there. You don't. So John announced this. Why are you doing that? No. John announced this. What you're doing is the wrong thing. Yeah, that's fine. You get exactly the same paradigm. Sure enough. Same split between the verbs. But another interesting thing about this is that. So in other words, whichever way you turn, you get the same difference. But another interesting thing about this is, this behaves like a DP, and there are verbs that don't combine with DPs, that don't combine with this, and they still combine with quotes, and they still go in these structures, like comment. And it's not just a few of them; there's lots of them. So it's raining. He commented, but you can't say John commented this. It's raining because this
it's
doesn't.
thus.
No, okay. Well, there's two different. Yeah, but you can't change the hypothesis on me. Okay, so the hypothesis is this. That's a problem for that hypothesis.
Yes, that is.
Thus, no English speaker that I know of can say thus. John said thus. Or as a recent reviewer commented.
It's not there, so maybe that's why it's not there. You can't say.
Okay, if it's not there, so suppose it's there but not pronounced, right? Then why is that not good enough to make John remarked? Why isn't that good without any overt complement? Because that invisible complement should be there.
No, it's a demonstrative. You can't have a demonstrative without demonstrative.
Well, okay. But now we've got a big edifice,
it's a
right?
demonstrative. It's an indexical.
Right. But it's not a DP because it goes with things that don't.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm saying is, in the end, I don't see any advantage. Right. I don't see any advantage. I mean, thus, it has to be a null version of thus. It has to be a non-DP version of this. It gets complicated pretty fast, and you have to say that sometimes it seems to be replacing that way. As opposed to just saying, okay, they're just clauses, and why can't they host parentheticals? Other things can host parentheticals. So I think all the things that you're asking about exist, except for the thus case, which I really think doesn't in modern English case. But they're different. Preposing exists, but it's contrastive. So I don't think
the
you can
coordinated,
reduce
I mean,
this.
no, it's in indirect, I mean, it's in, Virginia Woolf, it's
Yeah.
thus she ruminated. I mean, okay, that's a certain style, but that exists.
Well, the other thing.
So she felt.
Okay,
So
let me clarify one more thing. Quotes, clausal quotes can be introduced in other ways than the ones that I'm talking about.
Mhm.
I'm talking about the ways in which they can be introduced that are actually grammatically significant, because they are grammatically integrated to the extent that you can see grammatical properties popping up. You can also introduce quotes just with a complete sentence preceding them, as long as it meets certain discourse conditions, I believe. So, for example, if you say something like, John stood up and loomed over the class. You are wrong. Well, that's sort of okay, even though there's nothing there to introduce the quote, you are wrong. But, he stood up, he loomed, But if you say, John went to New York, I love Paris, you just can't make that into a coherent discourse, because, there's no sort of introductory sequence. So many of the things some of these things like, John, if you say John said something like this, then you may have set up the discourse conditions for introducing a quote, and maybe won't see some of these grammatical. So I'm not saying this is the only way that you can introduce a quote, and maybe Virginia Woolf, because I think there's a lot of it. So thus he spoke, but it did well or not. Speak, by the way, also, to bear in mind here, speak is not a say verb in this theory. Right? It doesn't have the complement taking predicate say as part of its meaning. So you can speak as much as you want to, but you never have to say whether you're asserting or. So it's not just a semantic field of say, of speaking that matters. It's the specific semantics of predicate. And so again, you can sort of play on that by using verbs like saying, Frederica and I were talking, and then maybe I could quote something that she said. But I haven't. That's not a say verb. So it is important to kind of keep those things separate, and I didn't do quite as good.
Well, I was just wondering if you think there is an interaction between the presence of they say pronouns or logophrase pronouns in the subordinate clause and the force of this clause, or not?
The presence of
they say pronouns or logophrase
I don't know.
pronouns?
I don't know.
Because you could imagine if
You
there
could
was-
imagine, yeah.
the force would be specified.
Yeah.
No, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I agree. No, I don't. I really haven't looked.
Because in that case, I guess it could mean that when you have words like shout or discourse, where you said there is no
Right.
you need a force specification in the clause, then that would mean you need this kind of.
That's absolutely right. So
you have
yeah. No. I mean, I guess I'm still playing with the representations. So, so the kind of idea that you're thinking about would work most clearly if.
Sorry, could you say what the question was?
The question is whether you get differences between force encoding clauses and non-force encoding clauses with respect to things like they say readings, right?
Right.
With respect to?
Things like they say readings of pronouns.
They say.
And the answer is I'm not sure. If the presence of the force phrase layer, if that's the right way to think about it, if that layer sort of makes something opaque, for instance, then you would potentially predict such effects. And if that layer is present, but I think that layer is present even when the embedding verb doesn't encode force. It's always present under say. So the prediction will be all say complements as opposed to all non-say complements. And I'm not sure that it's a very good question. And there's a lot of things like that where I suspect there's something going on, like no, let me not. Oh, well, I will. There's inversion under for native speakers of English. There's a kind of para version of English for most of us where you have inversion in subordinated WH clauses. So he asked, would she come for dinner that night? Which I didn't grow up saying, but as soon as I read McCloskey's paper on this topic, I instantly became a speaker of the dialect. I don't know whether, and that's far better with. I can't say they investigated. Was it true or false? It's completely impossible. So there are differences like that which I suspect ultimately have to do with force, but I haven't done the homework to know. So yeah, it's very interesting if you figure it out. Jonathan, do you want to go back to that?
Well, I have a couple of questions. One is, by the way, that there's some other fellow heretics. There's a paper by Robin Cooper and myself last year in the Journal of Logic and Information about quotation, and we do argue for an analysis of, say, ask that unifies the direct and the direct quotation and the embedded one, essentially.
Very interesting. Okay, so I'll get the reference from you. There is also, it's a paper that doesn't actually quite go in this direction, which I regard as going in this direction. It's actually Firth's paper on embedding speech acts, where he doesn't actually give an analysis of the embedding verbs, but he does talk about verbs like tell, which could be interpreted as, and he uses quotes as examples. But he doesn't actually put the frame for it, but you actually did. Okay, thanks. Sorry, I didn't know that.
I'm just wondering, so you say that the WH clauses don't have force as such.
Yeah.
So what happens in these sort of things like, the question is who left, whereas you can't say the fact is who left.
Right. Well.
So somehow that does suggest that somehow there is some basic. Whereas you can't say the fact is that Bill left.
Yeah.
Right. So again, it does suggest that somehow there's something intrinsically question-oriented about the WH clause.
Yeah. So I think there is something sort of intrinsically question-oriented about the WH clause in the sense that, that they are open, and that's what I mean by an issue, right? And I think that the question is such and such is really the issue is, rather than the question. I mean, it's a use of question.
Yeah, no,
right,
sure.
Right.
The topic of conversation.
No, I'm not. I guess for me, question. I'm used to using question in the sense more of like a proposition, in the sense of the abstract semantic object, not the speaker.
Right.
So that's what I'm
right.
saying.
And I guess what I'm
So when you say it doesn't have force, you don't mean that it's not an issue. You don't mean that WH complement is not an issue.
No, I don't mean that.
Okay, so that's
right. What I sort of think is that the WH structure is an invitation to create a discourse question because it has that open position. Right?
But you do mean that WH complement does have issue semantics.
I do think that's crucial. I think that's crucial because even in the domain of epistemics, you get verbs that take WH and that. Well, I'm not telling you this because you already know this, but you get verbs that take WH and that. You get verbs that don't even take WH. You get verbs that take WH only. So we've got a kind of. So what I believe now, there's two different subsystems swirling away. Their lexical semantics is very, very different. In the epistemic region, you get stative predicates, you get cause change of state predicates, you get change of state predicates. In the say, and you don't get any of those, But they overlap in that they both can involve the same sort of underlying logical structure, and that's what the WH structure reflects. And we find something very similar in, say, Japanese and Korean, where the same, where things work differently. There's no WH phrases. The WH, what people casually refer to as WH phrases, are just ordinary quantifiers. And the WH-ness is provided by the complementizer structure. So once again, I see that as being sort of the same thing. It's a way of creating an open position of some kind or another, and a way of therefore allowing you to impose the logic of a discourse question on it, or to interpret it as an issue.
But what about noun complementation? So like.
Yeah, noun complementation. So.
I mean, like ask the question.
Yeah.
Right? So you have asked the question, investigate the question.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So whereas you don't have announced the question.
No, you do not, and I do think that's related. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there's a sense in which announce the question is fundamentally bad for the same reason that announce why is it raining is bad.
Well, you can't announce an assertion either.
That's true. It's very tricky because of that kind of reason. I mean, I have tried to look at nominalizations. The trouble is you have to hold everything. You have to hold constant everything that you need to hold constant, and it's so damn hard to figure out what you need to hold constant. But I'm not sure. But yeah, I absolutely think that has to be right. And you know, one of the goals in the end is to try to say something systematic about the relationship between the clausal complement system and other subsystems of the complements, of complementation, right? I mean, it's not an isolated fact that, you know, believe takes these sentential complements. It also has all kinds of other properties. Ask has all kinds of other properties. So, yeah, absolutely, I think that's right. Yeah. But I think you know, I do think that calling WH complements questions is misleading. I mean, calling all WH complements questions is unhelpful. It doesn't divide the pie in the right place. And I think, you know, it's hard to see that when you look at what I call canonical complementation. When you look at these cases, what you actually see is what you see when you look at some nominal complementation. Yeah, it's very interesting. I know I'm trying.
I just have a little question on page 9. So what is modality only? What do you mean?
Modality. Where is it?
So the say verbs which do not encode force, and you mentioned modality.
Oh, yeah, I meant modality in the other sense, like sign versus spoken language.
Oh, I see this.
Sorry, yeah, modality in this, yeah, in that sense, not modals. I never use the word modal if I can help it. Yeah, so say it doesn't encode anything actually except for the abstract predicate, except that I think you can't use it when somebody signs. That was what I was. By the way, but as I collect my hand up, the ambiguity of the predicates involved here is so profound that wonder is a say verb, which for French speakers is not so surprising, but for English speakers is very surprising. So it's like se demander in French. In English, so it's ambiguous in English between mental, you know, the mental thought process, and so you can say things like, he wondered, should I read that book or should I just skip it? Absolutely nothing like that. And also think is a say verb. So, in addition to being an epistemic predicate, it's also a say verb.
One quick question about that. This ambiguity in such cases, is it always the case that the say verbs take an additional object, or observe to me that, or?
They differ. They differ in whether they do or not. The best example I can think of offhand is if you, within the ones that have question force, so there's ask, where you can have a indirect object or not. So I can ask whether it's raining. I can ask you whether it's raining. There's inquire, where I can't really have a direct object. You can inquire of somebody whether it's raining, but it's extremely stilted. And then there's wonder, where you can't have an overt object at all. So it's sort of bound. It's me. I wonder to myself. It can't be. And you know, tell, you have to have a direct object. So you can't say he told that he was leaving. You have to have the. So they're pretty variable. What is interesting is that once you hold everything constant, the number of verbs in any given space reduces so much that you almost have only one verb per combination of complementation properties. This came up this morning in some conversation over coffee, I think.
It's Maurice Gross's idea and his structuralist
Oh,
catalog.
okay. Yeah.
He said, you know, what is, and he just said that's linguistics, just to take each verb and see what he could do, and that's what his work was.
Yeah. Well, this is a little bit different, but just when you get to the end of the day, you know, you have wonder, which is for internal, ask, which is external and can involve somebody else, inquire, which is external only, and you sort of, and that's kind of it. It's not really anymore. So you know, it's clearly okay, let me put it like this: the epistemic predicates do not ever have a goal argument, I believe. So, know, believe, etc. You can have a direct object, but it has to be, it's like convince, it has to be, it's the person who's undergoing a change of state, change of epistemic state, right? So you got these kind of characteristic profiles of overall argument ticking properties that varies from domain to domain. So I think it's true that the say domain has a kind of characteristic profile like that. But then the individual verbs seem to be able to choose.
More complicated.
What's that?
It's more complicated than just you always have can have C. So.
Yeah. Within some subsystems, it's pretty regular. Like, if you look at the manner of, if you look at the means of saying verbs, I think they all behave the same. They don't differ from each other. So, shout is the same as whisper. And there's hundreds of them and they're all the same. But then within the cases like ask, you get a lot of variation. So it seems to depend which domain you're in. Okay, thank you.